Welcome back to another history venture. Today, we have headed back east, just outside of Philly, to explore an important turning point in the United States Revolutionary War. Getting hands-on with history, going over how a pair of defeats in Brandywine and Germantown, an ill-supplied army winter camp, and a man named Baron von Steuben all linked together in today's historic venture. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes of Valley Forge, we need to first understand why we are here and why it is such an important encampment. So let's jump on in and take ourselves through some of the more important events to form the United States. The year is 1763. The 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, has just concluded, moving all French land east of the Mississippi to be part of the current British colonies. Due to the expenses of a long war with the French, far from the mainland, and a needed constant military presence within the colonies, Britain needed to recoup the losses and maintenance costs. This was done through a series of increasing taxes and cost-cutting measures like the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Quartering Act, and many others. With each set of new taxes and laws released, just increased the friction between the people living in the colonies and upper-level government members running the colonies, and Britain really as a whole. By 1770, the country was just a few more actions away from all-out rebellion, and they received an eventful with the Boston Massacre taking place, setting the newspapers ablaze throughout the colonies, becoming a major stepping stone and helping the colonies start working together just 2 years later in 1772, creating the Committees of Correspondence. This was an attempt to unify the colonies and use their weight to try and reduce some of these new laws. But these were largely ignored by the British. And the following year, the Tea Act was enacted, followed up by the Boston Tea Party. All of this friction officially started a fire on April 19th, 1775. With tensions between colonists and British leadership at an all-time high, fears of an all-out uprising or revolution were feared to be almost inevitable at this point. In an attempt to suppress the Patriots, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Gage ordered the military to openly seek out and seize militia weapons and black powder stores throughout the colony. They had received word there was a large stash on a farm in Concord, Massachusetts, so they quickly moved to come up with a plan to take it out. While discussions were occurring on how to approach confiscating or destroying it, Patriot spies were able to receive this information not long before the British troops would set out. This head start was vital in the skirmishes to come. As the British were preparing their forces to march towards Concord, 2 men were hastily sent on horseback by the Patriots in different directions to spread the word they were coming and to round up as many militia members as possible to thwart the British raiding parties, with the most famous of the 2 riders being Paul Revere, scrambling throughout the countryside, setting warning signals along the way to spread the word as quickly as possible. Lexington would be the first to witness violence. A small ragtag group of militia attempted to stand in the way of the imposing British force. Roughly 70 men were trying to block hundreds, and this went about as well as you would think. After firing one volley towards the Patriots, they realized just how outmanned and outgunned they were, quickly retreating out of Lexington, leaving a few killed and mortally wounded behind. By the AM hours of April 19th, the British were marching into Concord. Unknowingly by them, a much more formidable militia force was building up on the other side of town, consisting of hundreds of men this time around, instead of just a measly 70. The British forces were split up into a few different detachments to find this stash hidden on a farm. Thinking the main force was moving in to raise the entire town, the militia army moved in to hopefully stop them. The British detachment moving into downtown Concord, seeing this large militia gathering move in, retreated to set up a defensive position against the Patriots right on their tail. The militia quickly moved to attack the British and moved in to fire their first volley, becoming the first major engagement of the Revolutionary War, which would later be known as the Shot Heard Round the World, forcing the British to retreat all the way back to Boston due to constant ambushes along the way. The Revolutionary War has now begun. Now, let's fast forward a couple years to September 11th, 1777. The British had set their eyes on Philadelphia in an attempt to not only take the city, but also demoralize the revolution by taking down the Continental Congress, which is within the city, making it the current capital. George Washington, the leader of the Continental Army, was tasked to repel the British forces in Brandywine. The battle was going well for the first few hours, with Washington's forces holding a strong defensive line along the Brandywine Creek. But this would quickly change with fog rolling into the area, allowing British forces to exploit the new cover to send a large force across the creek undetected. They then pounced on one of the Washington's flanks, catching them by complete surprise, forcing Washington to send extra troops over to try and shore up the collapsing line. And at the same time, the British sent another large attack in a different location along Washington's line in an attempt to just generally overwhelm and try and collapse the entire front. And this would do just that, completely changing the tide of the battle. With most of his reserves engaged in the flanking force, he couldn't do anything about the second line collapsing. Washington, understanding it's better to preserve as many men as possible rather than continue fighting a losing battle and losing more troops than needed, ordered a hasteful retreat. This may have saved his army, but would mean giving up Philly in the process. Just a month after, Washington would find himself in a prime position to take the fight back to the British by surprise attacking a detachment of the original army from Brandywine a month earlier in Germantown, just a few miles north of downtown Philly. A battle plan was laid out to encircle the British and attack at once, catching them off guard. Unfortunately, weather would show up just in time to ruin the battle once again. Thick fog rolled in just as the troops were moving into position, forcing units to become separated and disorganized. Since everyone was falling out of unison, it meant the attack would kick off at different times throughout the lines, completely dropping the element of surprise of most of Washington's forces, allowing the British to collect themselves and get into defensive positions. As the battle went on, Washington's forces became bogged down and lost all of their momentum. With sections becoming so disoriented from the fog, they started skirmishing with themselves, confusing their own men as the enemy, forcing Washington to call off the attack and retreat once again. After a couple long seasons of fighting and dealing with troublesome supply shortages, it was time for the Constitutional Army to set up camp for the winter. Even though they had endured 2 defeats from the British, resulting in losing Philadelphia, spirits were generally high within the troops. They had just gone toe-to-toe with some of the best armies in the world at the time and came close to winning. It had just been a very long campaigning season, traveling throughout the colonies to fight them. So everyone was just tired and needed some time to rest, heal, and just generally reorganize and recuperate during the winter months. Washington took his time to find just the right place to camp his army for the winter, looking for a good defensible position while also staying just far away from Philly so he would be able to have time to prepare for an attack if the British would march out to them, but also close enough to make sure the occupying forces knew they were lingering nearby. And so he chose the plateau of Valley Forge. The Continental Army would march into camp on December 19th, 1777, with about 12,000 troops and hundreds of supporting members as well. So this wasn't just some small army camp with a couple raggedy old tents. No, this was a full-fledged, almost city, and it just showed up here overnight, which it did technically become one of the top 5 biggest population centers in the colonies. Just imagine that some of these other areas have many years, and this one just showed up and they had to build then and there. The men would quickly move into building living spaces for everyone, constructing over 1,500 log cabins, just like the one back here behind us, throughout the plateau. This significantly helped the men stay protected from the winter elements throughout their stay. The troops would build miles of trenches throughout the perimeter of this plateau and the overall camp, and create a series of earthen forts along the way, just like the one we're standing in right now. They were basically built with these wood walls with a thick layer of earth to take any cannon fire firing back. And then in the middle of the forts, right behind us right here, is the storage bin for the cannonballs and extra black powder. So it was basically like a makeshift root cellar, just to give it a little more protection for any outside fire coming in. Because you don't want your entire cache to get hit and then take the entire fort out. That would kind of defeat the purpose. So you did have to make a little bit of protection. It's almost like a much simpler version of what was built at Fort McHenry, with their gunpowder and ammunition stores being kind of in those underground earthen embankments with layers of concrete and stone and then earth on top to absorb shell hits, just so you don't have this catastrophic explosion of all your reserves. All of this extensive building was also great for the men and just kind of keeping them busy during their winter stay. And it kept them warm as well, so they're not just like sitting around on the cold days doing nothing, waiting for frostbite to take hold. It gave them an activity to do to keep their bodies moving and fresh, and like I said, generally just kind of warmed up and ready to go. With the infrastructure not stopping there, they even eventually built an impressively large bridge over the Schuylkill River, opening up easier access trade to farmers on the other side. The Army, for the first few months or so, was in relatively good shape. They were receiving enough supplies to get by and keep chugging on along. Any shortfalls were met by local farmers and general hunting and gathering throughout the entire area. And one of those supplies that they were foraging for was timber, because all of those log huts didn't just build themselves, and the timber wasn't just shipped in from somewhere else. They picked this landscape clean of timber for miles around, but which, as you can see today, it's come back relatively well due to conservation efforts over the years since the camp was here. But as the weeks ticked on by, supply shipments and Continental Congress were becoming increasingly shy of the desired amounts of goods to keep everyone supplied with clothing and food, placing more pressure on the local farmers who would quickly run low on stores as well. Diseases like influenza, typhus, typhoid, and dysentery began to run rampant throughout the camp, which wasn't really uncommon at the time, with a bulk of the diseases appearing throughout the winter and was at its peak during the spring. This would end up killing about 2,000 men in the process, which could have been much worse if not for the supporting members of the community, like nurses, surgeons, and sanitation rules implemented by Washington and his staff. And the real size and scale of this entire camp is really hard to show in just this video. The trail just encompassing this whole thing is a little over 7 miles. And one of the staples here is right behind us. This is where the magic happened. This is the HQ where Washington and his support staff were running the ins and outs of this military town. At its peak, housing more than 20,000 people, all being managed out of this small house right behind us. So, even though the war has been raging on now for 2 years, the Continental Army still only resembled a ragtag force full of a bunch of random militias stuck together. And really they weren't this like cohesive fighting force just yet. So the Continental Congress and George Washington more or less kind of knew the major issues that needed to be fixed. Well, Washington had more hands-on perspective of it, but he was telling Continental Congress what needed to be fixed before they would start once again bringing the fight against the British. So in February, a man waltzed into camp claiming to be their saving grace. Baron von Steuben was born in 1730 in what was known at that time as Prussia. This included land predominantly in current-day Germany, Russia, and Poland. Through his youth, he had moved around different areas in the region, eventually finding himself in the Prussian military, serving from 1747 through 1763. He experienced a good amount of activity while fighting in the 7 Years' War, or also known as the French and Indian War. Once it concluded, he was discharged. Since there wasn't any major conflicts going on for them at the time, they just didn't need such a large military presence. During his extended military service, he quickly moved up the ranks, starting at Lance Corporal and going all the way up to Captain. And after being discharged, he would move into a position called Grand Marshal within the court system and would work here well into the 1770s, when he eventually found himself low on funds and acquiring a lot of financial debt. So he started to attempt to re-enlist in the military, but every country he turned to rejected his pleas. So, in a last-ditch effort, Steuben reached out to Louis de Saint-Germain or Germain, not really sure how to pronounce that last name, the French Minister of War, to see if he could go to the Americas and help with the Revolutionary War, since there were rumors swirling around that they were paying handsomely for experienced officers. Steuben was quickly set up to meet with Ben Franklin and Silas Deane, another name I'm going to butcher, by his friend to work out a possible contract. Unfortunately, it didn't really go as it expected for him, because they couldn't offer to pay for his services at that time. With his hope completely shattered from this news, Steuben needed some time to consider the offer. After quite a few days of pacing back and forth, thinking about this offer, and having to really cool his head and really just look at the circumstances he was in, he reluctantly accepted. With a long journey across the Atlantic ahead, he swiftly prepared and left for the colonies. Once arriving, he traveled directly to the Continental Congress, where he was able to negotiate an actual deal for payment. They told him he would be paid at the end of the war based on all the contributions he had given them. After the meeting and contract was finalized with Continental Congress, they quickly sent him out to Valley Forge, which is where we're standing at right now. Arriving in February of 1778, where he met with Washington and got to work reforming this ragtag army. He created an ingeniously simple code of rules and training that could be universally taught to train everyone in the camp. So he began to pull 100 troops from each brigade to personally be trained by him. They were then tasked to go back to their brigade and train the rest of the troops. And almost all that training happened in the very fields right behind us. He would quickly earn the respect from his peers because of his excellent teaching and no-nonsense attitude. This respect went both ways too, since he was able to finish training in just 2 months for something that normally took a lot of armies years to develop. This greatly impressed him by how fast the military became a cohesive fighting machine. This made everyone throughout all the ranks eager to go on their first bout against the British. Steuben would eventually go to create a full-fledged handbook for the military. This was widely adopted by the Revolutionary armies and further on, setting a base system of rankings, trainings, and disciplines for everyone now and in the future to follow. And the man right behind us is Baron von Steuben, commemorated here in this large statue for all of his achievements right here in Valley Forge. Before the battle plans could get moving, the supply shortages needed to be desperately met. You simply cannot go fight long, drawn-out skirmishes low on food, ammo, and other supplies. If you cannot properly feed and clothe your own forces, why would they want to stick around and fight ill-prepared? Washington would write a few pleas to the Continental Congress throughout the winter that the supply issues were getting worse. He was really beginning to worry about losing morale within the army. This would take some time because a new quartermaster wouldn't be named until March. Nathaniel Greene reluctantly answered the call because he would rather be on the front lines commanding his men. He was worried he would be lost to history and thought only the commanders on the front lines in the battles would be remembered. Little did he know at the time, this would become his claim to fame. He would only agree if he was promised to go back to a commanding general once these duties were complete. Some of his first acts as this new quartermaster general was to bring on 2 others to help manage the finances and supply lines. Men named John Cox and Charles Petit. He would quickly set out on a top-to-bottom investigation of the department and reorganize absolutely everything. Discovering the previous officers running this department were an absolute mess and held horrible records of how many supplies they had, where they were, and also ruining most merchant relationships around the colonies because of missing payments, unfinished deals, and just zero communication. He and his team worked tirelessly to fix all of the issues plaguing the supply chain, and it didn't go unnoticed. He was able to reestablish regular and abundant supply runs into Valley Forge within a couple weeks of taking over. A relieved Washington praised the quick turnaround, and so did the army as a whole in general, bringing morale up quickly within the bustling camp. His exploits didn't just stop there. He was able to accomplish all of his goals with making the department competent again, bringing supply lines back online, and fixing relations with merchants. He was even able to create resupply caches for the army once they leave Valley Forge, giving them a quick emergency access to anything they may need while the battles ramped back up. It is June of 1778. A well-supplied and newly trained Continental Army was eager to show off what they could do to the British. Word would come in from Patriot spies that the British occupying forces in Philadelphia were leaving, heading back to New York. Washington would take some of his army to surprise them on their march back, and so a plan was put together, and the Battle of Monmouth was on. Falling into place, Washington's forces were getting set up and ready for battle. But unfortunately, this battle wouldn't go exactly to plan. One of the forward marching generals, Charles Lee, would be the main issue, and the first to make contact with the British forces. And the plan was for him to do this, basically to get the British attention to push, thinking it's a smaller force. Then Washington would move up in and reinforce him, becoming a trap. But that isn't quite what happened. At the start of the battle, Charles was overwhelmed and terrified of that imposing British force coming straight at him. Fearing for his own life and his men's life, he quickly set out on an all-out retreat, losing his own confidence and the confidence from his men. Not soon after this, Washington, continuing on with the plan, would run into all of these fleeing forces. Washington's quick thinking and reorganization saved them from absolute and complete disaster. After some reshuffling, he continued on with the plan, once again completely losing the element of surprise, just like the Battle of Germantown in the fall. The battle would continue on with a much more successful continuation compared to the start. Both sides dug in with attacks coming from really both armies, just trying to get some kind of an advantage. This would go on throughout the entire sweltering June day. By the evening, the British would eventually just pull back due to general fatigue of the troops. And Washington controversially followed suit with his own men, understanding they were just too tired and needed a break. The heat was really starting to show, and a lot of men were starting to suffer from heat illnesses. So the battle basically ended up in a draw, which normally, yes, this may not be the best outcome, or an outcome most would think is good, but this was huge for the revolutionary movement. Taking on the British army, well outmanned, and fighting them into a draw was huge for the Continental forces. It was proof they really could have a legitimate chance against one of the best militaries in the world. Helped by fresh tactics and training, supplied by efficient and consistent supply lines, and new life would breathe into the Patriots' cause and become a moral turning point at the time for the colonies. But this war was far from over, and something we will definitely have to come back to. Well, that brings us to the end of today's history venture, where we were able to get hands-on with Valley Forge and the immense impacts it had on the Continental Army and Revolutionary War, going over how a pair of defeats in Brandywine and Germantown, an ill-supplied army winter camp, and a man named Baron von Steuben all linked together in today's historic venture. Thank you for watching the video, and make sure to subscribe for more if you like this one, of course. I'm trying to make about one of these a month, so this isn't just like some one-off video I'm doing in general. And for the future, hopefully it grows enough so that we can explore some larger stories throughout the US and possibly outside of it. And so let me know of any kind of cool or unique, interesting stories we can cover in the future. And yeah, I'll see you on the next one.